Hi, folks. Let's get this started. I'm Ricardo Méndez. I'm the head of governance at Marinade Finance. And I'm going to be talking basically about some lessons that we learned through the launch of our NFT-based governance. Now, I have a strict no pitching policy for my own talks, so I usually just talk about, I don't talk too much about the project, but since I can't assume that we all come from the same platforms, given the variety of people that we have here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what Marinade is up front and where do the NFTs come in. So, Marinade is basically the leading liquid staking platform on Solana. By leading, I mean that the next protocol that's doing something similar has, the last time I checked, about less than half the value, the same value staked. And now Marinade's goal is not just to get as much stake as possible and reap the fees, but to actually to increase Solana's Nakamoto coefficient. Now, who doesn't know what the Nakamoto coefficient is? Oh, okay. So the Nakamoto coefficient is basically the number of parties that need to collude in order to subvert the network. So basically, the higher this number, the better it is for the network because it's going to be much harder for parties to collude. How Marinade does this is that it takes the SOL that people give it to stake and then distributes it algorithmically to validators that comply with the rules of an open source strategy while avoiding the super minority. So effectively, this increases the number of validators involved in the network and increases the chance and decreases the odds of concentrated stake being a threat to network security. When I last checked, and the numbers may have changed since I last spoke, Marinade was staking SOL to 476 different validators at the time. Now, Marinade, where does the NFTs come in? Marinade uses the MND token, and if all you care about is having protocol ownership, you can just get the MND token and keep it as is. But if you want to participate in governance, then you take a bundle of MND and you lock it up for 30 days. And this results on you getting an NFT, an octopus chef right now. The more MND you lock, the larger the octopus becomes. This was just a cute visual thing that the team decided to do. The octopus size really doesn't have any particular effect on governance. Even the smallest octopus that you can use makes you a marinator. Now, what does this mean? It means that you can, with this, you can create proposals, you can vote on proposals, you can participate on some Discord channels where the forum discussion around these things happen, and you are also going to be able to sway some of the protocol parameters. This is part of the ongoing proposals that we have right now. Now, that's pretty much it regarding Marinade. So, everyone cool? Cool. Now, Marinade launched this NFT-based governance on April 4th of 2022, just a little bit under 7 weeks ago. Anybody wants to hazard a guess about what was my first day with the protocol as a full-time contributor? Yeah, pretty much the same day. I had been involved with the protocol before. I was advising them on a few specific areas, but I didn't really have a full view of what was going on. So I basically had to show up, do everything live with the things that were being launched. So what we're going to talk about is 5 lessons that we have learned during this process, and there have been a lot more than that, but I only have 20 minutes. So we're going to be talking about 5 lessons that I learned during this process of showing up and having to do things live. And the first one is that you need to accommodate all appetites. Because depending on appetite and budget, people may just have the budget for takoyaki, which is like this really small octopus snack on the left, or they may have the appetite and budget with the entire octopus right there. Now, what does Marinade do for this is that this is barely readable, but as I mentioned, you can lock any amount of MND, starting from 1,000 to whatever, and then you're just going to get an octopus of a different size. Now, why is this important? Because Marinade's recent bottom was at about 5 cents or around there. By the time that the governance launched, it was at 17 cents, and just a couple weeks later, it was the smallest octopus you could get to participate would have set you back about $300. Now, $300 may not sound like a lot, particularly for somebody who's used to Ethereum fees, but at the time this was, I think, 5 or 6 SOL. And at that point, people just start considering if they should be locking this or not. And the thing is that if you don't have small tiers, you're going to raise the barrier of entry for people to participate in the protocol. Maybe 1,000 MNDE is not going to make or break a particular vote, but it is going to exclude people. If the cost of this is too high, it is going to exclude people that you would want to have participating. We've had, during this process, we've had some great suggestions that come from people rocking some tiny octopus chefs. For all I know, these people are whales, because you can have multiple NFTs on the same wallet and they all aggregate voting power. So for all I know, they're whales that just choose to identify themselves by a tiny one, but I really wouldn't have wanted to miss out on those voices. So this thing, they're just accommodating everyone, is fundamental. Now, lesson number 2 is that you shouldn't have any mystery meat. On the case of the takoyaki that I mentioned earlier, well, this thing is basically just a ball of dough with a chewy bit on it. So how do you know that the chewy bit is actually octopus? And it is because takoyakis are prepared right in front of you. You get to see exactly what's going into the food, so you know right there if you want to eat it or not. Now, we had this thing with a proposal. This was actually the second proposal that went to a vote, but it was the first actual real proposal, because the first one was a live test. And I'm not sure if you can read it from there, but at this point, this is the voting ends on 1.5 days. Proposals run for 5 days. And at this point, the proposal only has about 1 million votes. Now, by this date, we had about 27 million Marinade lock-in to NFTs, and proposals have a required quorum of 7 million votes, or the proposal fails for lack of quorum. And sure, we don't have enough data. We don't really know what to expect at this point, because we've only had one test proposal, but the test proposal had 12 million votes in it. So I'm looking at this thing 3 days in, trying to figure out, like, what the hell is going on here? Why do we have a case of voter apathy here when this is a proposal that is going to directly benefit the price of MSOL, the derivative that you get back when you stake Marinade? This is something that would directly benefit marinators. There's no reason why people shouldn't be voting on this. And after staring at it for a while, I realized that we're only showing 2 options, for or against. But there's actually a third option that people can vote on, which is abstain, that for whatever reason, Tribeca, the governance platform that we're using, was not displaying. So I bring this up with the team, they make a change to Tribeca, they send a pull request. This is how the proposal looked about 12 hours later when the change actually went live. We had 3.5 million votes on abstain that people were just not aware that I wasn't aware that were there. And at the time that I was worrying that we had 6 million, that we were 6 million votes short of quorum, we only were like a couple million votes short, which actually showed up during the process that we updated the interface. So the key thing is that you need to optimize for transparency, and you need to optimize for observability. Now, you could argue that all this data is on chain, that the people could go query it, but the thing is, most people don't necessarily have the tools or the knowledge to go query the votes on chain. Or you could have noticed that when you went to vote on Tribeca, if you went to assign a vote, the Tribeca UI would have shown you the percentage of votings on each one, but now you need to, notice that the other one isn't showing the abstains. You need to convert from percentage to number of votes to know how far this thing is along. If you're cooking for people and you expect them to eat it, you might as well prepare the food right in front of them. So what I think that is fundamental to a governance process is that you need to dashboard everything. You need to be sure that you're putting the information right in front of people. And this is a work in progress still with us. We're still getting time to build everything. But I want to see a lot of information that we don't even have yet. Like, for instance, do we have large wallets that hold a lot of MNDE, but for some reason aren't voting at all? Do we have wallets that always vote against proposals? Do we have wallets that always abstain? So we can try and reach out to the community and figure out why this is. This is something where, by the way, the folks at Flipside Crypto have been very active helping us. So if you're building a project on Solana, I would very much advise looking into them. They have been great. I wanted to give them a shout out. Now, lesson 3. Now you know that you need to dashboard things to see how much movement there actually is in the system. By the way, this is, next slide, if you're squeamish about food, you may want to avert your eyes for a moment. Okay? So this is called sangnakji. It's a Korean dish. People call it live octopus. And sangnakji is very simple. You basically take an octopus, you chop it up, you cover it with sesame seed and sesame oil, and you serve it. And this thing is lively. I mean, this thing will fight you. You try to pick it up off the plate with chopsticks, and the suckers are still holding onto it. It's going to be moving 20 minutes after it's on the plate. You chew it, and you need to make sure that you chew it right, because otherwise it can get stuck in your throat and choke you. No, I'm not even kidding. This thing is lively, and it's active, and it's an experience, but here's the thing. It's not actually alive. What you were seeing there is purely nerve reaction of the pieces reacting to the oil. And that's lesson number 3. You can't assume something is alive just because it's moving. Now, let me tell you about the governance process and how it happens. We first have some free-form discussion on a channel. There's a governance chat. Then once the proposal is ready to be formalized, whomever wants this thing to happen, does a write-up, posts on the governance forums on Discourse, where discussion can last for weeks as people raise their objections, they make their changes, they suggest possible caveats that the person may not have thought of. And finally, it goes for formal voting on chain on Tribeca. Now, the first 2 steps in particular can be very lively. They can be so lively that they can be hard to keep track of. But here's the thing. Actual discussion, if you start paying attention, is still limited to a relatively small group. You can see that there are hundreds of wallets that have a large amount of MND in them. I think there's more than 1,700 NFTs that have been created overall. But if you look at the discussion, it's a relatively small group of people. So again, you can't confuse activity for engagement. Because engagement is activity is not what you're going for. What you're going for is engagement and community participation. So again, we're talking about observability. How we're handling this is that we're running some regular queries on what kind of activity we're getting on Discourse, because I want to be sure that we're not only seeing posts, but that we're seeing a healthy ratio of community comments versus team comments, right? You don't want this just to be the team members arguing with each other. You want the community involved in the decisions that take place. So, 4th thing, now we've seen the food, we know what's in it, we know that the food may fight back. What are we eating? And that's the 4th thing that we're learning. Omakase is not only tasting, but it's efficient. I'm not sure if you know what omakase means. It's a Japanese expression that, if I recall correctly, goes something like respectfully leaving to another to decide what's best. And it's a concept where you get to the restaurant, and instead of picking off a menu, you just tell the chef to prepare whatever they want, which makes sense because, the chef is more familiar with what they have that day, and they know what's fresh, and they know what's going to be good. Now, what does this mean in this context? And let's see if we can change. What does this mean is that you may not actually want to do on-chain proposals for absolutely everything that goes on in the protocol. Why? Because you're going to run into cases of voter apathy. Or you're going to run into cases that I've seen, like DAOs that end up, since they decide to do everything on chain, they need to end up having a vote on small things like a $5,000 grant, for instance, which is going to lead to voter fatigue, which leads to proposals failing because of lack of quorum, which leads to users reluctant to make small requests. And This is even sillier on cases that I've seen where somebody has already done work for the community, or say they went out to a conference and they actually ended up paying for the party, and because it's a DAO and doesn't have a bank account, then this person paid out of pocket and is asking for a refund, and they don't actually get the refund because the vote fails for lack of quorum and needs to do it a couple of times. You want to avoid this kind of things. And so an approach that we're trying out is just defining a charter for the team. And not just one, defining multiple charters for different areas of what the core team is working on. The idea is to have the DAO vote on approving the charter, which can include limits, it can include budgets, it can include limits of power as well. And then the team is free to operate within the limits of this charter. If they want to operate outside of it, they need to go to the community for a vote. An example would be, for instance, a grant process. The grant process. We were discussing with the community what would be their preferred approach to for a grant process. Now, imagine that you do it fully on chain, where the team does not disburse votes for a grant unless there is an on-chain vote where the community has verified that some work already took place, right? How do you do this? Two ways, right? You could just show up as a volunteer, do whatever work the grant requires, then present that you ask for a vote on the grant to get the funds dispersed. But you had to do a whole bunch of work without knowing if the community actually wanted you in particular to do it, or where there might be multiple people working on the same grant at the same time. So then you could do for 2 votes, right? When one vote, you ask the communities to say like, hey, we do approve for Joe or Jane to work on this thing, and another vote to get paid, right? This is just going to, again, lead to voter fatigue. We think that is much cleaner, and this was the conclusion that that came out of the community suggestions, to just vote on a grant committee. Basically, we proposed a couple, 3 people, including somebody from the community. We propose some guidelines, we propose a budget, and the community approves that this is how they want grants to be run. For as long as grants are within that scope, everything's fine. If they're effectively saying we approve this 3 wallets to assign funds for this thing. If you want to run out of that, if you want to run out of scope, then you need to again go back to the community. We think this is not going to work just for grants, but also with different charters, again, for things where you want to be able to move quickly or to have a certain amount of discretion up front. Consider partnerships, for instance. Our voting process for proposals can last anything from, say, 2 to 5 weeks, because you're going to have some discussion on the forum, you're going to have 5-day voting, then the proposal needs to be executed, and there's some time delays in here for safeguards as well. Partnerships, you want to be able to move quickly, first of all. And second, if you have a voting for a partnership on chain and then you have a public discussion, then you're basically signaling to competitors what you're thinking. And if they're centralized, then they get to move faster and could basically circumvent what you're doing, could, what's the right word here, front run you effectively. So this is why we also think that we're going to define a charter for the partnership team to act upon, so that the community agrees to the guidelines. And lesson number 5, this was actually a personal lesson for myself that I wanted to bring in. And before we get in, let me tell you like a quick story. So as you can see, I like octopus and I like food. And I was in Gangneung. Gangneung is this little town in South Korea on the coast, on the northeast side of South Korea. I was there in the summer, and they have this reputation for really good sashimi, actually. It's a small place, so you're not gonna find like a lot of places that speak English, particularly not like the fun small places. But I go into this little restaurant with my wife, and we, between Google Translate and signaling, we made ourselves understood that we want some octopus sashimi. But they ask us like kind of like what size. They go in, they get the octopus, which is there on a tank, and we go in and sit down. And 2 minutes later, this comes out. I mean, beautiful plate, glistening, fresh, like you have no idea. I take a piece of it, put it in my mouth, start eating, and it's warm. And so I feel like, okay, we did something wrong. Like, why the hell will you warm up the sashimi? But you know, whatever, with some miscommunication issue, continue eating, and it was really fresh and really nice, it was just warm. And by the second or third piece, I realized that it's not that they warmed it up, it's that this thing was alive 2 minutes ago on a summer in the water, and they just killed it because I just asked them to kill it for me. So I'd eaten fresh food before, like I ate this still moving octopus, I'd eaten sashimi before. I wasn't really prepared for the impression that eating this thing caused on me. Likewise, I've been involved in quite a few DAOs. I've helped design a governance process. I've never had to run the whole thing from scratch. And that is lesson number 5. No matter how familiar something sounds, no matter if you think you've done it before, never assume that you have any idea what you're getting into. Fortunately, we only have 20 minutes. There are a lot more things that I could discuss, but feel free to grab me after. But I would like to leave you with a request, which is that if you have dealt with this, with the transition to a DAO, I want to talk to you. So come find me or reach out via email or Twitter. Thanks. And I managed to not be over time, so if we have time for questions, if anybody has any, either about governance or food. Nope, exceedingly clear. Last chance? Cool. Thanks, everyone.